Hello, it's me, Ariza Gaming, and welcome back to another video about how to recycle resources infinitely in Oxygen Not Included. This time, we're going to talk about the Frosty Planet Pack DLC and its implications on getting your ultra-sustainable critter-based resource loops going. In the previous videos in this series, we've talked about mostly using Glossy Drekos, Slicksters, Sweetles, and Grubs to take water as an input, turn it into plastic and then sour gas, and then recycle all of those products in a long convoluted chain that ends up giving you way more output material than you put in. And these methods can be scaled up infinitely. We also talked in the last video about a few tricks that you can use to really get the most out of these loops, such as using plant mutations, like exuberant plants, such as using rubs to actually pollinate your plants and get more yields out of them. And of course using micronutrient fertilizer to get more efficiency out of your plants, having them grow quicker. But today, I mostly just want to talk about the content specific to the Frosty Planet Pack and how you can use that to make your bases even more sustainable. In front of us here, we've got a list of the 3 different critter types introduced in the Frosty Planet Pack DLC, and the main one we're going to be focusing on is the Floxes. If you have a look at the green box, you'll see that a Flox, when fed Pikeapples, which are fed from phosphorite, you can effectively turn 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite into 1.67 kilograms per second of dirt that the Flox just poops out, and then you could shear about 20 kilograms per second of wood from the Floxes that are fed with that much phosphorite. And that's a lot of wood. You can feed them bristle blossoms as well, but you only get 5 kilograms per second of wood per 1 kilogram per second of water that you feed the bristle blossoms. So generally feeding them with the phosphorite is a lot more efficient from a resource multiplication point of view, and as we'll go on about when we continue in this video, we're going to have no shortage of phosphorite, so this is going to be the basis for these loops going forward in this video. So the combo to the left is the Floxes and the Bammoths. This is the combo that is introduced to you right in the Frosty Planets. These critters are both available on the default Frosty start, and this is what the developers expect you to do. So you feed your Floxes, preferably from Pikeapples, you get all the wood out, and then what we're going to do is we're going to actually feed that into an ethanol distiller. And this will turn half of the wood into ethanol. It will turn about 2/3 of the remaining products, so 1/3 of the overall products, into polluted dirt, and then 1/6 of the overall throughput as carbon dioxide. And for now, we're just going to ignore these products, but we're going to come back to these later. The Bammoths can take this ethanol and feeding them either plume squashes or nosh sprouts, but you're probably going to be doing it with plume squashes on the Frosted Planet, and it's a bit simpler because the nosh sprouts require dirt as well. The Bammoths, when fed 10 kilograms per second's worth of ethanol, they're going to give you about 1.33 kilograms per second of phosphorite back out. And you'll notice it's more phosphorite than we put in. So this is good. This means that we can feed in the input phosphorite, and we have a little bit that we can take out we can use to grow the system. And we can keep doing this forever if we keep putting in more phosphorite from the environment up to the point where it's the size we want, and then we can stop feeding it phosphorite from the environment and the loop will just sustain itself once we've finished growing it with that multiplication. And Bammoths are really good because the Bammoth patties can be crushed with rock crushers into clay for ceramic production, very useful insulative material, and a lot of reed fiber. We'll talk about Regal Bammoths in another video, but suffice to say, the Flox Bammoth loop is pretty good. It's what the devs intend for you to do, and it is sustainable. Now, the only thing is, you've got to get the power going to actually run the ethanol distillers, but there are ways of getting around that. However, one thing I do want to mention is there's a critter that's actually a bit more directly synergistic with the Floxes than the Bammoth, and that is the aforementioned Glossy Dreco. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Glossy Drekos. They produce plastic. They're great. If you feed them with mealwoods, the mealwoods will take the dirt directly produced by the Floxes, and then when you're feeding Glossy Drekos mealwoods, you get about 5 times as much plastic as the dirt that you put in when you shear the Glossy Drekos, assuming that they're happy and that they're in a hydrogen environment. So that's really good. And they give you 1.5 kilograms per second of phosphorite out from the dirt. So that's 90% of the dirt that you put in. So this actually gives you more phosphorite faster than feeding it to Bammoths. And you get this massive amount of very useful plastic byproduct. And you can either use plastic as a building material for your colony, which is really good, or you can actually boil it into sour gas and then recycle resources even harder. And we'll talk about that more in the video, but that's basically going to be the basis of what we're doing here. And we'll see, because of the sheer amount of wood and dirt that you get from the Floxes, we could really increase the efficiency of our resource recycling loops compared to just using the base game content. This is indeed a pay-to-win case. There's one other critter I'll talk about very briefly. We talked about them a little bit in the previous videos. Spigot seals. You can feed them nectar or sucrose, and they'll produce ethanol. You also get tallow from the seals themselves when they pass on. In the previous video, we talked about using them as an alternative to grubs in that they were going to consume the sucrose from Sweetles and then produce byproducts that you could recycle. And the conclusion at the time was that it was pretty similar in overall efficiency to using grubs. However, since the game has updated, tallow now melts into biodiesel instead of crude oil. So unfortunately, you're not going to get any sour gas boiling from the seals, the X-seals. You are going to get biodiesel. That can all go into a petroleum generator. You get the polluted water out, you get some water out of that. But when you're feeding the spigot seals with the bonbon trees, with the nectar, A, you have to run a load of ice makers to make all of your output water into snow to actually feed the trees. And B, you get very little water compared to what you actually put in. So my viewpoint on spigot seals is use them if you need tallow. And that's pretty much it from me. Tallow is very useful for cooking. You can use it to make certain foods. Squash fries is very relevant because you can feed that to Bammoths to get the Regal Bammoth variant that will actually be a renewable source of metal ore. We will talk about that in another video. But in terms of just multiplying resources and running a completely sustainable colony, spigot seals are not really the direction to go in anymore. So you may have noticed there's a load of maths on the screen. We're continuing on from the previous videos, but I'll just summarize it briefly. We have a couple of different terms here, and we have some expressions to the top right. So A is the ratio of primary product, i.e. the input, water for the spigot seals in this diagram, but phosphorite for the Floxes and, yeah, the Floxes. A is the conversion ratio of the primary product to the secondary product. So in the previous video, that was plastic from the glossy Drecos and sour gas. In this case, it's dirt, but it can vary. We've got a few different primary products that we're actually looking at in these three simple flowcharts. So the Floxes turn 10 times the amount of phosphorite into ethanol for the Bammoths. They produce 1.66 times the amount of dirt you put in for the glossy Drecos. And the spigot seals produce 0.8 times the amount of water you put in when you're feeding it to the tree for nectar. And then B is the ratio of converting that secondary product back into the primary product. And the product of that, if it's higher than 1, that's good, because that means that you're getting more resources out than you're putting in. If it's not, then that's not so good. So the top expression we have here, XT and XI. So XI is the amount of material that you're inputting into your loop. So for all of these flowcharts, we're just going to say you're putting in a fixed 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite. This could vary to be whatever you want it to be. XT is the throughput of the system once you've gone through the loop and once you've recycled everything. C is an internal recycling term that we're going to talk about later. None of these loops are internally recycling at the moment, so C is 0 for all of these. And we can calculate the overall throughput of the system. XE is the excess materials we can take out of the loop while still allowing it to run infinitely and sustainably. And you can see here, since the last video, we've introduced this sigma here. This is the sum of all of these different terms. In future resource loops, we're going to have multiple different pathways at once. So that's going to be fun. You just add them all up together, add the excess products from all of them together, and then you subtract out the 1, which is the amount you require to get the system started. And that's going to... And in this case, the excess products are pretty simple. You get a little bit of phosphorite out for each of these loops, and some other byproducts that aren't directly related to the loop's sustainability. And then for the spigot seals, you can see that it's negative, which means you can't infinitely do it, which makes sense. And then YE is just the extra products that we're taking out. So it's not the primary product. It's not the amount of excess primary product we've got. It's the amount of the excess product that we're trying to take out. And you can follow these loops in a couple of different ways. I'm talking mostly about two different cases in this video, one of which is maximizing the amount of plastic you're getting out. As I mentioned before, plastic's very useful as a building material, and you use it for further resource multiplication later down the line. So that's going to be the primary aim of what we're doing here, getting as much plastic as possible. And the Floxes and Glossy Drecos is a fantastic combo for getting lots of plastic. Granted, you've got to have the Floxes in a cold room, and you've got to have the Glossy Drecos in a warmer, temperate room. But that's not too hard to accomplish. And the reason I'm doing this video now instead of a year ago when I was talking about it is because since the November Quality of Life update, they've added the Printerceptor story trait, which allows you to print foreign critters and seeds on your asteroid for databanks and printerpod charges. So you can, if you have that story trait enabled, even if you're on the Frosty Planet, you can always ensure that you get a Dreco and a Mealwood, and then you can get this loop started pretty quickly. This has huge implications for the game, but it basically means we can mix and match these critters a lot more freely than we used to be able to. You'd used to have to go to space or wait 500 cycles to even get anywhere near something like this. But now, the possibility of doing this earlier is available. And yeah, the other product that we're trying to maximize, in this case, I've put some loops in here that are taking the dirt out. Because these loops are quite efficient, you can take a large amount of the dirt out and still have enough phosphorite to run the system. So in the case of the Floxes and the Glossy Drecos, you can take 0.56 kilograms per second of dirt out, and you've still got your 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite to recycle into the loop, and then you can use that dirt for other things. I don't know what else you want to use your dirt for. So that's the basis of what we're talking about in this video. We're trying to maximize products, and we're trying to use these critters to get there. So if we move on to the next view. So here, we're doing something a little bit more complicated with the Bammoths. This time, we're actually taking the polluted dirt that came out of the ethanol distillers, and we're composting that with the composts into regular dirt. Now, this does require some duplicant labor. What you want for this is you want high-strength duplicants. High-strength duplicants will flip the composts more quickly. Each compost transmutes 0.1 kilograms per second of polluted dirt into dirt, and each compost needs flipping every 50 kilograms. That sounds like a lot of labor, and it is, and the composting errand usually takes 20 seconds. So if you've got 0 strength dupes doing it, they're going to be spending 4% of their time, of their daily schedule, of their daily working schedule flipping composts, which is not great, especially if you've got a really large flow rate of dirt like this. But if you have, say, a bionic duplicant that has all strength boosters, and they have 40 strength, they're going to get that compost flipping time down to 4 seconds. And you can use Lit Workspace to make it even faster, but it's pretty irrelevant when you've got high-skilled dupes. So use high-strength duplicants, and you can reduce the amount of labor a lot. Throughout this video, I'm going to talk about loops that both do consider composting and don't consider composting, because you might not want your dupes flipping composts all day. But if you do, you get so much dirt out of the wood. You get a third of the wood from the Floxes out as dirt. And this transforms into a huge amount of phosphorite. 4 times the amount of phosphorite than you would get just from harvesting the Floxes' poop alone. And this turns into an absolutely absurd amount of plastic when this dirt is fed to mealwoods, which are fed to Glossy Drecos. You can see here on the left, this is our pretty basic Bammoth loop, except we're just composting the dirt. And we're turning 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite into 8.8 kilograms per second of phosphorite, 42 kilograms per second of plastic, and we're still getting the clay and the reed fiber and the carbon dioxide out of the Bammoths. So this is gigantic, and this is so efficient that this is already matching the efficiency of our very advanced sour gas boiling loops with stuff like plant mutations, rubs, micronutrient fertilizer, things that are quite complicated to actually install into the resource loop properly, especially early in the game. This is very simple in comparison. You can do this as soon as you get the critters. There's not a lot of advanced technology needed at all, and it's almost as efficient. So this is really why I wanted to talk about the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. And I've also got a loop here where we're comparing the Bammoths with when they're fed plume squashes to when they're fed nosh beans. Now, if you're feeding Bammoths nosh sprouts, they can eat from the plant, but it's more efficient for them to eat from the beans. I don't know why. They actually are just more efficient at processing the beans themselves. You can feed them either. This also lets you fertilize the nosh beans if you really care about that. Same with the plume squashes and the pikeapples. You can fertilize all of these in separate greenhouses and then feed the frosty critters the products in their ranches. So fertilizer is pretty easy to accommodate here. But the glossy Draco's eating the mealwoods. Mealwoods cannot be micronutrient fertilized. So you're going to have these in the ranches anyways. They eat from the plant anyways. But with the nosh sprouts, those plants eat some of the dirt, so you've got less dirt coming out of your plastic. This does cut into your excess phosphorite and plastic a fair bit, but it does give you a little bit more clay. If you really need a lot of ceramic, you could do this. But especially because you just find the plume squashes on the planet with the Bammoths, I'm generally just going to recommend using plume squashes for Bammoths. And if we have a look at the actual variables down here, you can see that our primary resource ratio has gone all the way up to 8.3 for the dirt, for the Floxes, Dracos, and Bammoths with the plume squashes. Our B ratio is still 0.9, so we're still getting most of that dirt out as phosphorite. And you just get a very large amount of plastic out. You can also take a very large amount of dirt out of this loop and still have enough phosphorite to keep going. You could also still get a significant amount of the clay or the ethanol out as well as the carbon dioxide. So if you just want to have a load of dirt to play with, you can totally do that as well with these Bammoths. And it's pretty straightforward. But you do need to do the rock crushing for the Bammoth patties. And this does require labor. There's no way of avoiding that, but it's probably worth it. But you can see here, because of the amount of Bammoths that you use to eat the nosh beans, you do end up getting slightly more reed fiber per kilogram per second of ethanol that you're feeding the Bammoths. So just bear that in mind if you're using nosh beans. Okay, so how do we continue to convolute this? Well, now what we're doing instead of using Bammoths, we're actually going to run the ethanol through a petroleum generator. Now, if we're not doing anything with the carbon dioxide, the polluted water is still noticeable. You get a fairly large amount of water out compared to the amount of phosphorite you're putting into this loop. If you feed the water to glossy Dracos and bristle blossoms, if you feed the water to bristle blossoms and the glossy Dracos eat the bristle blossoms, they produce 2.5 times the amount of water you put in as plastic out, and they produce about 45% of the water input as phosphorite. So it's not quite as efficient as mealwoods, but you can fertilize bristle blossoms if you want to do a mixed branch greenhouse thing, but we're not going to talk about that this time. So we can take both the water and the dirt, we can sort that out. And alternatively, we can just extract the water. This is a lot of water you get out of it. Obviously, there's no overall phosphorite cost because you get more phosphorite than you're putting in, and you're still getting a very large amount of plastic out, even if you're doing this. So this is a pretty good loop to do. And obviously the ethanol generators, the petroleum generators, will give you the power needed to run the ethanol distillers. So if you don't need the clay from the Bammoths, just find the glossy Draco instead and get to work. If you're getting this water out of the polluted water, you're going to have to filter it either with filtration medium, which I don't really recommend, or just by boiling the polluted water and condensing it again. That's not going to take too much heat energy if you're feeding the generators hot ethanol. And also, just to highlight, all of these ratios that have a little star on them in here, this is assuming that we're using the maximum number of critters to transform all of the product into these byproducts. If you find that you don't actually need all of these excess resources, you can just use less critters to process everything. And we'll talk about the number of critters that you're using for all of these builds later as well. And we'll compare it to the previous builds that we talked about in previous videos. But yeah, pretty good system for getting both plastic and water out of. And then if we actually do compost the dirt, then you can see we get vastly more plastic out of it. It's about sort of just over 3 times the amount of plastic out, and you get far more excess phosphorite out as well. You can use the phosphorite for metal volcano geotuning. You can refine it into refined phosphorus. You're not going to need this much refined phosphorus, to be honest. So I would actually recommend at this point, if you don't need all this plastic, taking out the phosphorite as dirt sometimes, using that for whatever you want to use it for. But if you do need the plastic, you're just going to end up with a load of excess phosphorite doing this. But yeah, make sure to get those high-strength dupes to flip all the composts. Now, here's where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. So what we're doing now is we're taking the carbon dioxide and we're going to feed it to the molten slickster, who showed up a little bit early in the video. And they will turn the carbon dioxide into petroleum at half the mass flow rate. And then, for this simpler loop, we're going to feed the petroleum to the petroleum generators again. And we're going to get polluted water out and carbon dioxide back out. So this is where this internal recycling term C comes into play. We're now actually feeding this carbon dioxide back into the beginning of the loop. This is forming a geometric series and multiplying the overall amount of petroleum in the system up to a fixed limit, because the amount of carbon dioxide we're getting out is less the amount that we're putting in. This does reach a fixed limit. We just use the ratio 1 over 1 minus C, and we just multiply this petroleum throughput by that number to get the final flow rate of the system. And then obviously the polluted water, we're just taking that and doing the exact same thing we're doing with the polluted water from the ethanol generators. We're just mostly feeding it to more glossy Drecos via mealwoods and bristle blossoms. So you can see down here, we've got all the terms. Our ratios A and B have stayed the same. We've added this extra C ratio, which means the excess products we're getting out have increased. Now, one thing I will say is this increase at the moment is only very slight compared to the previous case where we're just leaving the carbon dioxide alone. You don't really have to bother with this because the actual throughput in plastic is much higher just from the composted dirt. This term dominates everything in this specific case. So if you don't want all of the carbon dioxide, you can just freeze it into a solid and just keep it hanging around the bottom of your base, or you can vent it into space. But you do get a little bit more out of processing it. You do get a little bit more power out as well. You get a little bit more meat out of all these Slicksters. But it is firmly optional in this case, I would say. This is where we start actually sour gas boiling. So this is where we sort of start to get directly comparative to the previous video's discussions. In this case, instead of actually feeding the wood to ethanol distillers, we're actually just going to boil it. In a very physical way. You can use a volcano, you can use anything you want. But wood sublimates directly into carbon dioxide at 600 degrees C, 1 to 1. So we can turn all of this wood into carbon dioxide. Now, you will need to cool it back down again with a thermoaquatuner to get it to the point where your molten Slicksters can eat it and turn it into petroleum, but we're sour gas boiling. We're going to have so much power, you're not going to know what to do with it. So the molten Slickster is going to eat the carbon dioxide, turn it into petroleum, and then we're going to heat the petroleum up again to the point where it boils into sour gas. And if you don't know what sour gas boiling is, if you condense sour gas down to very low temperatures, it turns into roughly 2 parts methane and 1 part sulfur. The methane can be heated up again to get natural gas. And you get a lot of natural gas out of this. You can run so many natural gas generators off of this. There's many videos on YouTube of people building absolutely gargantuan builds. You're really going to struggle to process all of this natural gas. But if you do, not only do you get so much power, you also get a lot of it back out as A, polluted water, which you can recycle, and B, carbon dioxide, which you can reinsert back into the loop. Now, you also get the sulfur out, and we can recycle the sulfur as well. So Sweetles will eat the sulfur and turn it into sucrose at 50% mass. And then you feed the sucrose to grubs, who will turn it into mud at 100% mass. And then you boil the mud and turn it into 60% water and 40% dirt, and then you know what to do. The Drecos are looking at each other, you know what to do. So, all in all, using this process, we still recycle the dirt from the Floxes earlier. This loop is, in this case, showing it without composting the polluted dirt, so we don't get any polluted dirt with this process because we're just sublimating all the wood instead of ethanol distilling it. But overall, you get about half the plastic that you get out of the compost-related route earlier. The advantage of this is there's no manual labor required except for ranching the critters, so that cuts down the labor a little bit. But you're still getting about half of the overall products out, so that's a pretty good trade-off, I think. Obviously, the system's quite complicated, but the potential is quite a lot higher because there's so much power. You can just power the rest of your base off of this. But what I would say is, boiling and then cooling this wood is going to require a large wood management area, and that is probably going to consume a large amount of power. I don't know how much. I would say you're probably going to get less power out of this than you would out of the previous videos where we talked about sour gas boiling and you're using the other contributing factors to increase your efficiency. But it's still going to be pretty good. We're going to directly compare these products in a bit anyways. And then if we go down here, so if we're aiming to extract water out instead of extracting plastic, the loop looks slightly different. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll take the plastic from the glossy Drecos and we'll just heat that up and we'll boil that into sour gas and we'll mix it back in with the sour gas we're getting from the Slicksters, converting the carbon dioxide into petroleum. So we're going to combine these two terms and then we're going to just do what we did before with the Sweetles and the Grubs and the natural gas generators. And then we're going to extract all the water out straight from our steam turbines. And then we're just going to take all the plastic, boil it into sour gas, and continuously recycle it. And you can see here, even without doing any composting, we're turning 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite into about 3.6 kilograms per second of phosphorite, and then almost 20 kilograms per second of water. And if you haven't realized, 20 kilograms per second of water is a lot. That is going to sustain way more duplicates than you should probably be actually running on all but the most fancy computers. So this is a very powerful loop, very little manual labor, but you just need to get everything built and you're probably going to require supercoolant. So this is firmly late game, but still I think pretty achievable. Moving on to a slight further complication. You can see we've actually managed to fit everything on the screen, which is good. So what we're doing in this case is we are composting, so we're running the wood through the ethanol distillers, we're getting all the dirt out, we're turning it all into plastic. And this is just essentially the combination of the principles from the previous two builds. But the net result is you get a lot more plastic out, a lot more phosphorus out, or a lot more phosphorite out. But again, the overall efficiency is slightly higher than the build where you don't do the sour gas boiling, you just run it through the ethanol generators, but it's not drastically higher because again, most of the plastic output is just coming from the dirt over here. I can't stress this enough. But overall, we're looking to get about 10 kilograms per second of phosphorite return for a 1 kilogram per second investment, and then we're getting up to 55 kilograms per second of plastic. So these are absolutely huge numbers. But in this case, with the plastic extraction, there's relatively little sour gas to work with, so there's not actually a lot of Sweetles and Grubs involved. The sour gas mass is very low to the overall mass of plastic coming out, so this is probably a bit easier to build, but you're going to get a lot less power out of it. You are going to get some power out of processing all of the ethanol, but it's going to be a lot less than you would get out of the increased amount of natural gas you get. So I don't think anyone's going to be stressing out about that. And again, if we actually want to take the water out, this does look slightly different. We're going to put all the plastic back in. We're going to boil all of this into sour gas. Tragic, I know. And then we're going to combine that back in, and then we're just going to take all the water out of the steam turbines. Now, what I will say is this is a case where the sour gas loop really does shine. The efficiency is way higher than it would be running this through an ethanol generator, because we're turning so much plastic into sour gas. You can turn 1 kilogram per second of phosphorite into 12.7 kilograms per second of phosphorite and over 50 kilograms per second of water. But what I would say is the recycling term C here is quite large, so you're getting a lot of petroleum and sour gas out from the carbon dioxide and from boiling the plastic. So there's a lot of Slicksters involved, there's a lot of sour gas being recycled into this. And we'll talk about how that affects the amount of critters you need for each of these builds later on. But this is the most efficient pathway that I managed to think of with all this stuff. Again, don't bother feeding the Floxes the water via Bristle blossoms. It's not a real efficiency saving compared to just using glossy Drecos for that. And the vast amounts of wood that you get out of the process is really what's driving the efficiency on the Floxes. So now we're just going to go back in time a little bit and compare it to the previous video. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing with the Floxes. If we're just taking, if we're just feeding them Bristle blossoms, you get a little bit of wood out. You have to feed this to the molten Slicksters to turn it into petroleum and then sour gas, and then you recycle this. And the excess products are obviously a lot less, but this is comparable to the basic route that we had over here, which we talked about in the previous video, where you're just feeding the glossy Dracos water, you're turning the plastic into sour gas, you're recycling that into more water. This was the basis of our discussion last time, and you can see with the Floxes we can achieve a similar overall efficiency. However, you do require more critters for this because you have to have the molten Slicksters here as well to handle all this carbon dioxide, so it's not really an upgrade. I wouldn't strongly consider doing this, but I'm just showing it for comparison with the previous builds that we talked about. So just to give a brief summary of the previous builds we talked about, overall this is what we settled on in the previous video. Glossy Dracos eating mealwoods to process all of the extra dirt as well, with the Sweet Hills Grub Grubs and molten Slicksters. If we add the Grub Grub Rub into the mix, it's a plus 50% growth modifier to the plants in the affected ranches with the orange arrows. So in this case, our A ratio increases to 3.75 instead of 2.5, and our B ratio stays the same because that's not dependent on the actual plants in the system. But our C recycling ratio goes up a lot because we have more sour gas in the system because of the increased efficiency on turning dirt into plastic and sour gas via the mealwoods. So we get more recycling going over, we get more excess products overall, but it still doesn't really hold a candle to what we've been doing with the Floxes earlier in the video. If we introduce micronutrient fertilizer, this complicates things quite a lot, because especially with the Dracos, you have to have the plants in a greenhouse that you're fertilizing, and then have the Dracos wander into the greenhouse, and then wander into a separate room to get groomed. And that's quite complicated, and we're not really going to bother with it, but theoretically, if you manage to do this with a max attribute Bionic Farmer with 40 attribute points, you consume relatively little micronutrient fertilizer to keep all the plants topped up. You can effectively double the plant efficiency rate, so this A ratio increases to 5 times. The B ratio decreases a little bit because we're having to take some of the polluted water out to actually feed the fertilizer synthesizer. We're having to take some of the dirt out as well, as you can see via this portal and this pathway. We're also taking some of the phosphorite out. In this case, the phosphorite is just a byproduct that we're not directly using with this base game technology. But what you want to do with this loop is you want to make sure you're getting the amount of micronutrient fertilizer out that's proportional to the amount of extra water, so that your excess products are in sync with each other and you can keep fertilizing everything. So you can see a mild increase in efficiency, but still nothing compared to what we've been doing with the Floxes, and significant extra complication with the farmers. So again, I'm probably not really going to recommend this going forward. And then finally, I think this was actually the main pathway we were considering in the previous video for sour gas or bust. Using exuberant mealwoods. Now, in that previous video, I talked about composting the rot piles that come from the plants. Unfortunately, you don't actually get these rot piles out. You don't get them out at all, because the Dracos eat the plants before they can actually be harvested to produce the rot piles. So I've crossed these terms out here. However, even without using the rot piles, the efficiency of the plants increases drastically. You get a 6.67 times ratio on this A term for feeding the glossy Dracos. You get 4 times as much material out of the plants, but they require 1.5 times the amount of fertilizer. And they require the radiation, so adding radiation to your ranches and your greenhouses can be kind of annoying. You can use nuclear waste tiles for this, but that does put temperature constraints on what you're doing, and you need to make sure it's all actively cooled. You're probably actively cooling it anyways, but it's a little bit of extra complication, but it gives you a lot of actual benefit. The main benefit of this route that still makes it competitive with what we've been doing with the Floxes is you get more sour gas out the sour gas loop than you get in. So this loop itself, C is greater than 1, so you just actually end up recycling. You can recycle the sour gas forever, and you can actually cut out the initial bit where you're feeding the glossy Dracos off of the Bristle blossoms. You don't actually need the input water. You can take all of the water out. And I didn't get into the maths of that too much because, I mean, it's fairly arbitrary once it's infinitely scaling in 2 different ways. But it's still a pretty good technique. And then, finally, just to show you, this is all of the mechanisms that we talked about in the previous video in combination with each other. Again, we're not doing any of the composting, so this was the peak efficiency we managed to get the system at in the previous video. And that was 1 kilogram per second of water turning into about 10 kilograms per second of water, and then about 21.5 kilograms per second of sour gas. Most of this you can turn into plastic, so let's say it's about 20 kilograms per second of plastic you're extracting out. So you get a decent amount of water and plastic, and this is using grub rubs, exuberant plant mutants, and micronutrient fertilizer. But if we go back to the Flox loop here, you can see we can get way more water out, we can get way more plastic out. And what you could do is you could actually split your system into two. You could run half of it as extracting water and half of it as extracting plastic. And if you had two mini loops of the same overall critter size as the main loop with the exuberant plants, you look to get about 27 kilograms per second of plastic out and 25 kilograms per second of water out. So the overall conclusion is that Floxes are so efficient at turning phosphorite into dirt and wood that you don't need to actually bother with the advanced tricks we were talking about last time if you have the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. Now, let's actually talk about critters and how many of them you're going to need. Now, there's a lot of maths on the screen. I'm going to explain it all pretty quickly. So these tables here are just showing the numbers of critters that you need for each of these pathways to actually process all of the resources, including the internal recycling. There's some formulas down here where we're just calculating how many of each critter we need based on the conversion ratios of water to plastic or sour gas, the amount of water left over in each pathway compared to the initial primary product, same terms with dirt, and then the relative volume of carbon dioxide compared to the initial primary product. So that's the amount that the Slicksters are using. CM is the relative volume of carbon dioxide produced solely through recycling with the sour gas loop. And then this AS term is just the relative volume of the sour gas. But if you have all of these terms, and we do from all of these flowcharts that we've done, you could use that to calculate exactly how many critters you need to process all of the resources. We also have this N term here, which it's 1 for Bammoths fed with plume squashes and 1.06 for Bammoths fed with nosh beans. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to compare all of these different pathways based on how many of each different critter type you need, how much input resources you put into these critters, and how much of the secondary product you get out of these critters. And what I've done is I've actually normalized all of these critter totals to 1,000 tame critters. I think for the most part, this is probably about as many tame critters as you're going to have in a typical Oxygen Not Included game. Even on a classic asteroid, that's like 120 ranches, that's quite a lot. Bigger systems are going to be pretty cumbersome to manage. We do have different columns. This column is showing the tame critters, but if you had them all as glum, just hanging out, not being ranched, but still being tame, and somehow not getting crowded, you need 5 times the amount of critters. You can also use a combination of tame and glum critters to achieve the same overall resource consumption and production. In this case, the amount of ranching is a lot less, but the amount of critters is still much higher than if you were just doing tame breeder ranches. So I've listed all of these different critter totals, but the bold one is the main one that's going to be relevant to you guys, I think. So if we have a look at the non-Frosty Planet pathway to begin with, where it's just Glossy Drecos and Mealwoods, Sweetles and Grubs and Molten Slicksters, there's no plant mutations, no fertilizer, no Grub rubs. These are the proportions I've got. So to feed 1,000 total critters, you would put 11.6 kilograms per second of water in, and you get 16.4 kilograms per second of plastic out, and your other byproducts. Yeah. But the overall proportion of critters is the interesting part. About half of them are going to be Glossy Drecos, eating all of the water and then eating some of the dirt coming out of it as well. And then you're going to have a relatively large amount of Sweetles because there's a relatively large amount of sour gas recycling going on in the loop. And you're going to have slightly less Molten Slicksters because there's a slightly smaller amount of carbon dioxide in the loop. And the amount of Grubs is always going to be a third of the amount of Sweetles, just based on... These two are directly in series, the Grubs are eating the byproducts of the Sweetles, nothing else is involved, so this is fairly straightforward for us. And you can see on the right here, we've got all of these different mathematical terms. These are all just taken more or less from the flowchart that we showed earlier in the video. So feel free to go back and have a look at those flowcharts if you want to validate that. But yeah, I'm really glad that we can normalize this now, because this means we can directly compare all of these different critter resource recycling pathways, both in terms of efficiency, in terms of input to output ratio, but also input ratio to the number of critters and output ratio to the number of critters. Like, which pathways are more efficient in terms of, like, which pathways you need less critters for to process the same amount of materials. So in this case, you need relatively few critters per kilogram of input water, but you're also getting relatively few kilograms of plastic out per the critters. So it's interesting to think about these things. And here on the right, we can just see directly the effect of introducing the grub rubs to the tree, i.e. the A ratio increases a lot for both water and dirt, and the proportions of carbon dioxide and sour gases system increase a little bit as well. So overall, this results in a slight increase in the amount of glossy drecos and a slight decrease in the proportions of the other critters. Nothing too fancy. In this case, the amount of input water consumed by 1,000 critters in this pathway is reduced down to about 7.3 kilograms per second. And then the amount of plastic we get out increases a little bit as well, to about 21.6 kilograms per second. So that's pretty good. We can see the effects of the increased efficiency from the grub rubs here, but in this case, you do actually have to have a grub in all of your critter ranches where the drecos are being fed with the mealwoods. You don't have to have them with the Slicksters, but it means you're going to have 2 less drecos in your ranch and 1 extra grub because the grubs take up more space than a dreco. So it's a little bit of complication, but you do get a payoff. And then if we continue down that line with the other non-frosty pathways, you can see if we add micronutrient fertilizer instead, the proportion of drecos actually decreases slightly, and the proportion of Slicksters and Sweetles overall increases slightly. The amount of input water required per 1,000 critters reduces as well, and the amount of plastic that comes out increases, but only very slightly. So in this case, it's mostly just a case of we're still getting a similar amount of output per the amount of critters compared to with the grub rubs. But the key benefit of the fertilizer is we're putting less water in. And then if we have a look at the exuberant mealwoods with the glossy drecos, we can see, again, the amount of glossy drecos has increased significantly, and the proportions of the other critters have all decreased in sync with that. Again, the amount of input water required to feed 1,000 critters has decreased a lot because the efficiency of the plants has increased a lot. And then, similarly, again, the amount of excess plastic we get out is very similar to the other enhanced base game pathways. So we're still getting a similar throughput of output materials based on the amount of critters that are processing everything. So the main gain is increased water efficiency, not extra plastic out per critter. And now, again here, if we look at combining all of these base game modifications, we end up with a very large proportion of drecos. Almost 60% of the critters in this loop are going to be glossy drecos, which makes sense because the plant's becoming so much more efficient. The water throughput decreases right down to 1.34 kilograms per second of input water. And then the product increases a fair bit as well, up to about 27 kilograms per second of plastic per 1,000 critters. So now, if we actually add the Frosty Planet Pack critters in, we'll start to see some different effects. So this is the extremely basic loop where it's just Floxes and glossy drecos that we were talking about earlier, where it's very simple and there's very little going on. You can already see the throughput of phosphorite in the system is very low. It's comparable to the throughput for the most efficient base game systems per 1,000 critters. And the amount of extra plastic we get out of the system is also very high, comparable to the most advanced base game methods. And in this case, 2/3 of the critters are Floxes eating all of that phosphorite, and then 1/3 of them is glossy drecos. So a different overall flow. And this means if you've got a large colony doing this, you're going to be actively cooling a lot of your colony to keep these Floxes happy. And similarly, if we have a look at the pathway here, where we actually start to where we don't do the composting, but we're aiming to extract plastic out instead of just wood. I've neglected wood from this whole case because this is just the basic term. If we're processing all of the wood instead to maximize the plastic, you can see we end up with a system where the glossy Dreco and Flox proportions are about the same, but the phosphorite throughput decreases a little bit, and the plastic output increases drastically. This is far more plastic than you get out of the base game systems, even the most enhanced base game systems. And then we're going to leave this one here, and we're going to directly compare it to the same system where we're actually composting all that dirt. And in this case, the Dreco proportion goes through the roof, because obviously they're eating all the dirt from the composts. That shows you the size and the amount of dirt that you're processing with all of these guys. And as a result, nearly 3/4 of the critters in your system are glossy Drecos, relatively few Floxes. And very little throughput phosphorite is required, only 1.3 kilograms per second, and you get 62 kilograms per second of plastic out per 1,000 critters, which is large. Again, even if we're only running a tenth of these critters, let's say you're running 100 critters, you could have, say, I don't know, like 3 Flox ranches and then like 9 glossy Dreco ranches. You're still going to get 6 kilograms per second of plastic out of a system like that. The reason I haven't done these tables based off 100 critters is because you start to get into discrete critter problems of relatively small systems. At that point, it's more based on the number of ranches you want to set up, and the inputs and outputs probably aren't going to be quite as exact because you're not getting the exact amount of critters needed to do everything. So that's why I've shown it per 1,000. But you can scale this size of critters to whatever size amount of ranches you're going to have in your colony, and this will all scale linearly. The input, the throughput, the output, and the critter sizes, that will all scale linearly, so you can just adjust this as needed. But yeah, very efficient when you're composting all the dirt. So now, let's have a look at the Bammoth systems just for comparison. In all of these cases, the amount of Bammoths is roughly half the amount of Floxes, and you're going to get a little bit more plastic out, and the overall throughput of phosphorite in the system is very low. So, you don't need that much input material at all per critter. You get a lot of products out. So that's pretty good. But again, most of this throughput is glossy Drecos because of all the composting. The table is overall pretty similar if you're feeding the Bammoths to nosh beans, but you do require a little bit more phosphorite going in, and thus the Flox proportion increases to suit. And then you get a little bit less plastic out, but you get a little bit more clay. But again, I don't generally recommend this, but I'm just showing it for comparison because you can do it. Now, if we look at the ethanol burning process, where we start to evolve the molten Slicksters to recycle the carbon dioxide, in this case, the system actually has still has a very large proportion of glossy Drecos. All of these systems that are involving composting are going to have a very large number of glossy Drecos. In this case, we've got a large amount because of the ethanol burning. We've got a lot of carbon dioxide at play, so the Slicksters are here as well. But we've got a lot of products on the other side that we're converting with the Drecos. But overall, the input material per 1,000 critters is very low, and the amount of products is still quite high, but it's not as high as it was before. And then you'll see this trend continues as we actually have a look at the sour gas boiling routes. So here I've got the methods that don't involve composting, and in this case the Dreco proportion of your critters decreases drastically because we're not processing anywhere near as much dirt. For the plastic extraction case, you've got about 1/4 Drecos, about 1/2 molten Slicksters, about 15% Floxes, and then a very small amount of Sweetles and Grubs because there's very little sour gas being recycled in this case. And the input phosphorite is low. The output plastic is lower than before, but this is still comparable to the amount of plastic you'd be getting out with the most advanced base game processes per critter. But you do have a massive amount of Slicksters, so you're going to need a robust Slickster ranching setup for something like this. Then if you're looking to get all the water out, the proportion of Drecos decreases even more, the proportion of Slicksters stays about the same, and the proportion of Sweetles and Grubs increases a lot because you're getting a lot more sour gas out. That means you're getting a lot more sulfur out. In this case, the amount of phosphorite goes down even more per 1,000 critters, but the amount of water that you're getting out is it's less than the amount of plastic, but this is still a lot of water. Admittedly, this is with 1,000 critters. If you had 100 critters, say you had 2 glossy Draco ranches, like 6 molten Slickster ranches, 3 Sweetle ranches, 1 Grub Grub ranch, and 2 Flox ranches, you would end up with about 1.2 kilograms per second of water out of that for free. Which is not great, but it's very achievable, and it's completely free water. But then, one thing to note is in these expressions, the ratios R, W, R, D, and CM, you need to multiply all the relative components all the relevant components in the flowchart by 1 over 1 minus C. So if we go back quickly and have a look at these, yeah. So wherever we're taking sort of the sour gas out, and we're taking the carbon dioxide out and we're using them on the Slicksters, or we're taking the dirt out and using the Dracos, we have to multiply all these terms by this ratio to determine the amount of critters in the system. But I've already done that for you in these tables, so don't worry about it. So yeah, we've accounted for this with these tables on these yellow pathways where it's relevant, where we've got some internal recycling. And then finally, if we're looking at the pathway where we're composting everything, we're doing the sour gas boiling, and we're evolving the Floxes, the Sweetle and Grub Grub proportion is going to be very low, because we're producing very little sulfur compared to just dirt turning into plastic, carbon dioxide turning into petroleum, and so on and so forth. So you're only really going to need you're going to need 2 Grub Grub ranches per 1,000 critters that are processing via this pathway. And the input phosphorite is very low, and the output plastic is very high. And then if we go over to the water extraction pathway, where we're just taking all the water out of the steam turbines, the glossy Draco proportion drops to about 31%, and then your Sweetles and Grub Grubs are going to increase massively, because there's so much more sulfur involved in the system relative to everything else. But pretty balanced between Dracos, Slicksters, and Sweetles. And the amount of Floxes required for all of this is very small. But again, in this case, the throughput per 1,000 critters of phosphorite is extremely small. And your output water is quite large. If you had a system a tenth of the size, you could do it with 1 Flox ranch, 1.5 Grub Grub ranches, and then like 4 Sweetle ranches, 3 Slickster ranches, 4 Draco ranches, and you're going to get about 1.8 kilograms per second of water out of that with just 100 critters. That's pretty good. Obviously very complicated, so you're probably going to want to make it a bit bigger, but not so big that you run out of space on your map for all the natural gas generators. So, yeah, what are my overall conclusions from all of this? So, Floxes are really, really, really efficient at turning producing wood and dirt from Pikeapples fed with phosphorite. Don't bother feeding Floxes Bristle Blossoms. It's not worth it in comparison to just doing stuff with Dracos. Bammoths and spigot seals are pretty interesting, but in terms of resource recycling, they're not really worth using. Use them if you want their unique materials. Use Bammoths if you want reed fiber, or particularly clay, because obviously you get reed fiber from regular Dracos. But Bammoths are a really good source of clay for ceramic, and spigot seals are a really good source of tallow. And again, you can use that tallow to make Regal Bammoths a thing and get the renewable gold amalgam from those. So that's the main use I'm thinking of for these guys. But overall, just using Floxes and Pikeapples and introducing them into the sour gas boiling loop with the glossy Dracos and everything else is much more effective than actually using the other base game techniques I've talked about. Plant fertilizer, plant mutations, and Grub Grub Rubs. And it's way easier to actually implement. So we're going to be going forward in Sour Gas or Bust with that. We have printed Floxes, we have printed Pikeapple seeds. So we can do this, and we're probably going to do this instead of the plant mutations, because we're going to get a lot more out of our loop, and it's going to require a lot less fiddliness to get started. So that's why I'm doing this wintry Frosty Planet Pack critter video this year instead of last year. Now that we're a bit further in Sour Gas or Bust on Twitch. And then the polluted dirt from the ethanol distillers can be composted into vast quantities of dirt. This gives you most of the efficiency in terms of producing plastic with these loops, but you can still achieve very efficient recycling loops without composting all this dirt, so you don't necessarily need all of that manual labor with your dupes. And overall, simpler recycling loops will require more input material, more critter, but you're still going to get a similar amount of excess products out per critter. The main benefit of adding the sour gas boiling and increasing the mechanical complication of your resource loops is reducing the amount of input material needed, not increasing the amount of output material. And as I mentioned before, Pikeapples can be fertilized pretty easily with a separate greenhouse because the Floxes eat the food from the critter feeder as well as from the plant. So we will look at that in future. I don't think you're really ever going to need to do it. You're going to get so much resources out of all of this stuff already. I don't think it's even worth the complication of adding the greenhouses, but at least with the Floxes, this is the basis of the loop, and you can do it in separate rooms. So I think that is worth investigating. But we're going to save that for another time, because this has already become complicated enough. But yeah, those are my overall thoughts on recycling resources in the Frosty Planet Pack DLC, and Oxygen Not Included. These little Floxes can get up to a lot. They can really make this whole sour gas boiling process a lot more efficient. Get so much dirt out, so much plastic out. You're going to have so many resources, you're not going to know what to do with them. But let me know in the comments if you have used the Frosty Planet Pack content to develop a thriving industry in your game. Because this is a bigger impact than I thought it would be from this DLC. And we're definitely going to look at it on Twitch in our run. One more thing, the Shatter Floxes. I should have mentioned this earlier. Since the November update, there's a new variant of Flox called the Shatter Flox. This is not relevant to any of this, because you shear them for glass instead of wood. So, the main benefit of Shatter Floxes is they turn Abyssite into dirt for free. But obviously, if we're using this loop, we can recycle the dirt infinitely as well as the phosphorite. So overall, you can just use regular Floxes for that and they're better. But early on, if you have the critter Fluxomatic on your asteroid, and you've got a lot of Abyssite, which you probably do, you can get some emergency dirt from the Shatter Floxes pretty effectively from them. And then you can get glass from them as well if you don't want to run a glass forge. But I would say the Shatter Flox is mostly an early game critter, whereas the Flox itself, I feel like is more useful as a late game critter. Which feels a bit weird to say. But that's it. That's my thoughts on the Frosty Planet Pack critters overall. Let me know if you have any comments, any thoughts. How do you like to use your Frosty critters? And yeah, I'll see you soon. Take it away, Whiskers. Bye for now.
Whiskers sends thanks to the following Twitch subscribers and YouTube members: 999999999, Ayla Ivo, Burglar720, FRD. Lagbot 30,000, Neo Deus Machina, Quantum Zari, Stinger's Playground, Sweet Danger Kitty, Terra Cloud, Christian Nielsen 9363, Mark Miller 5161, and Xantiphon.
Thanks to modern editing techniques, we can use existing footage to complete the film without
Reza Gaming.
Watch.
Jiminy Jillikers!
Reza Gaming.
Jiminy Jillikers!
Reza Gaming.
Jiminy Jillikers!
Reza Gaming.
Seamless, huh?
You're fired.
And with good cause.